Welcome to Accelerating Toward the Future State of Federal Human Capital Management, the third episode of Mission Forward, a video podcast series from SAP on government efficiency and innovation. I'm your host, George Jackson with FedGov Today. The federal human capital landscape is in the midst of a rapid evolution that includes workforce shifts, IT modernization, and AI integrations. Today, you'll learn how to seize on the lessons of past transformation efforts, sustain innovation over time, and seize the opportunity to deliver lasting value for your agency and citizens alike. For that conversation, I'm joined by Travis Hoadley. He is Industry Executive Advisor at SAP. Travis, welcome. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you. Thank you.
So let's start with this fresh look at core human capital management functions. Hiring, performance management are a few that I'd pull out. You can leverage your time at Department of Homeland Security or SAP, whatever hat you want. But a lot of state and local governments are doing the exact same thing. Give me a sense of what modernization looks like right now in state and local.
Sure. I think it's fair to reflect on sort of what's been occurring over the last 25 years. I think that most private sector organizations have been modernizing those functions at a fairly fast pace, while public sector organizations, including in the federal government, have been moving a little bit more slowly. And what that sort of looks like is for most federal agencies on the hiring front, they've been focused on how do we accept online applications? How do we reach a broader applicant pool across the nation? For performance, how do we take traditional paper processes and move those into an automated process? Sometimes that looks as simple as taking paper and making it into digital paper, putting it into a digital filing cabinet, right? But at the same time as that's been happening in the federal space, private sector companies have been looking at full comprehensive technology solutions for their human capital functions. Most of those are initially on-premise, and then evolving through another round of innovation, looking at software as a service solutions with greater configuration, better customer experience, better experience for leaders in their organizations that have analytics questions about talent. So that places most public sector organizations who are competing for the same talent at really a point where they need to modernize, right? So they've fallen behind their competitors, and now's the time to think about modernization. And I think that modernization really has sort of two components to it. The first is public sector leaders need to get smart about what's available today. So what do current leading software as a service cloud solutions look like for human capital? How powerful are they? What functionality do they have? How can they really change the way that you deliver service to customers internally in your organization? And then also change the career experience for an employee who's interacting with that software as well. And I think the second component that's maybe most important is reflecting on the current way that you do business. So that means standard operating procedures, core business processes, the rules that maybe govern what you're allowed to do or not do that might be different than some of your private sector competitors, and getting as smart as possible about how those two sort of areas can come together, right? So what does smart modernization that reflects a full understanding of your requirements look like so that you can really begin to catch up with the private sector that's been accelerating at a much faster rate?
Travis, you use this phrase customers internal to your organization. If I'm an IT leader and I want to fuel better collaboration inside of the organization itself, what kind of support, what kind of management changes should I be thinking about instituting to effectuate that?
Sure. So I think it's really critical if you're an information technology leader working with a human capital leader to acknowledge a few different things. One, in public sector organizations, we have sort of a track record that we can look to that describes what effective collaboration looks like. We also have a track record that describes what less than successful collaboration looks like. I would point the audience to reports from the Government Accountability Office or the National Academy of Public Administration. They've done some really good deep dives on implementations of technology that have been very successful, some that have been less successful, right? That really surfaces about 12 barriers that IT leaders and human capital leaders need to overcome together to be successful and to have an effective collaboration in the organization. And I would highlight three that I think are at least in the top five, but I think are important
Sure.
personally. The first is about governance. So it's really critical that don't fail to establish an effective governance structure and process. What I mean by that is that IT leaders, human capital leaders need to be at the table together, making decisions. They need to be on the same page strategically about where the organization's headed with an innovation or technology implementation that they're planning to institute. And they really need to be at driving decisions collaboratively. So that includes accountability when either organization does or does not perform what they've sort of promised to the other. It needs to be a collaborative effort where there's line of sight across those two organizations. Without that, when you do encounter challenges, delays, etc., it's really hard to overcome that if you don't have the proper governance in place. The next thing I would cite is clarity of requirements and the cost of those requirements. So it's very easy to begin an IT transformation or collaboration with an information technology organization, a human capital organization. And if you don't have your requirements very tightly defined and you have not costed those requirements, things can very quickly get out of control. What that really means is that it's important to think about. What's maybe different in the public sector than it might be in a private sector organization that you need to acknowledge, need to add development time or cost for when it comes to implementation. It means that you really need to be accurate and honest with each other about how much does it take to launch this transformation, how long will the transformation take, and what does it look like to sustain that transformation over time. It's very easy for projects in this space to become delayed or maybe to not deliver all of the functionality that was maybe planned on time. Uh, if there's not transparency at the beginning, those things tend to cause questions about whether projects should continue, right? So many projects have gotten 25% done, maybe not with a full understanding from both parties about what was happening in the moment. And that can be avoided if you really do some of that upfront definition work. And then the last piece, which I think is the most important, is staffing the human capital expertise that it takes to do an IT transformation. So it's really critical that you have what in the federal government we would call policy staff who understand the statutes, rules, regulations that govern your work, the sort of unique nuances for particular workforces that you might be managing. These tend to be frontline workforces or mission critical workforces, we might call them, so that those people can be at the table making sure that that workforce is being reflected when you're building a solution. If those people come to the table too late, it's often very difficult to be successful and to end up with a final product that both the information technology and human capital world are happy with.
I'm going to sort of preface this next question, Travis, with a small anecdote, but I promise there's a question on the other end of this. I'm informed by a recent conversation that I had with Congressman James Walkinshaw of Virginia about artificial intelligence. And he talked about his grandmother, who was a federal worker. And at the time, there were tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of typists for government. That was like a job function that doesn't really exist anymore. And in the workforce, and that's not unique to the private sector, it certainly happens in government, change is inevitable. And one of the big disruptors in the market right now is artificial intelligence and automation. Obviously, there are no more typists anymore, but if you're reading the tea leaves, if you're looking into the Travis Hoadley crystal ball, what's the next big transformation that AI and automation are going to provoke in the workforce of the federal government?
Yeah, it's interesting because in response to this question, I'd like to look backward as well. So it's important to acknowledge that, for the first half of the 20th century, the majority of the federal workforce was industrial or clerical. They did very predictable work that was easy to measure, that required a solid skill set that didn't change over time. For quite a while now, though, most federal civilian careers have been moving more toward what we would call knowledge work, right? So they require employees to apply skills in unpredictable ways to solve problems. You're hiring employees to drive mission outcomes more than to produce sort of predictable products or predictable, outputs like a typist might be doing.
Yep.
AI is really an accelerator for that shift, right? So it's going to change the way that many federal employees who do knowledge work perform their jobs. It's also going to mean that much of that work and many of those job functions that we traditionally did not associate with technology literacy are going to require a certain level of technology literacy. And so for me, it leads me to sort of sound the alarm that the Classification Act of 1949, which is the last time that Congress has taken up formally thinking about how we define federal work and jobs, is becoming woefully outdated and may not be able to survive um, the changes that are coming with AI. And what I mean by that, it's important to reflect too that people often talk about the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. It's really one piece of that act that was sort of left out was what we call classification in the federal government. So addressing how we define jobs and work. So all of that is to say that the world has been moving on since 1949. It's continuing to move at an even faster pace with artificial intelligence. Now is really the time for the federal government to think about what's the work of the 21st century look like and how can we change some of these structures so that we're not using post-World War II technology to try and make sure that the government's effective in the 21st century. And I would say, too, that some local and state government, as well as governments in other countries, have begun to address this in the last 15 to 20 years, but the United States needs to catch up with those folks who made some innovative changes.
One of the favorite parts of my job is that somebody can come in and casually drop a reference to the Classification Act of 1949. It's just like a mic drop moment, Travis.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, was barely it was barely a change from the Classification Act of 1923. So, yeah.
I mentioned at the top of the program the word innovation, and one of the goals of this series is to tease out thoughts relative to a phrase, persistent state of innovation. As you look at the workforce and the tasks that they're working on, how do you start moving the needle there? How do you start moving those innovations from just one-offs to a persistent state of innovation?
Coming from a human capital practitioner background, something that I think has been part of the dialogue about federal human capital, at least for the last few decades, is the movement toward away from being a compliance-based function to being a strategic partner with agency leadership, making business decisions, right? Unfortunately, when it comes to thinking about innovation or business transformations, we tend to form a special team. We give people an assignment that's on top of their traditional responsibilities and hope that in the extra time that they have beyond their regular job, that we'll see results and they'll be able to move the needle forward. And I think that human capital folks, we should reflect on what does it look like to actually staff a team that's dedicated to that full time. So I would advocate that organizations should consider having a permanent customer experience and innovation function staffed with people who have federal human capital policy expertise, information technology expertise, skills that might even be outside of the traditional human capital realm, to be working full-time on analyzing how's business going, how could we re-engineering that business, and what does it look like to be anticipating and putting forth proactive innovation projects versus being reactive to them.
If you're looking into that crystal ball 5 years, 10 years into the future, what's going to separate the agencies who are doing human capital well, who are integrating artificial intelligence and training into their operations in the right way, from the ones that aren't as successful in the future? Like, what are some of the key differentiators there?
I think for me, two things come to mind. The first is effective use of technology, and the second would be sort of reputation as a strategic partner. And so when it comes to technology, we've already talked about that many public sector organizations, including federal human capital organizations, have fallen behind when it comes to technology. If you miss this next phase of technology innovation, I think you're going to be quite behind, right? You reach a certain point at which it's difficult to catch up. And that also, is partly, uh, it's important to acknowledge that agencies are using legacy technology too that's going to reach end of life. So if we were to just look forward 5 years, don't really want to enter 2030, the 2030s, with technology that relies on COBOL programming. They don't make COBOL programmers anymore like they did in the 1960s. And so it's going to become imperative for those agencies to really update technology in order to continue just a normal business, let alone a better quality or level of business. And then when it comes to being a strategic partner and providing strategic value to an agency, um, I reflect on the Chief Human Capital Officers Act. So, as part of the stand up of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, Congress created the formal Chief Human Capital Officer role. And one of the responsibilities of Chief Human Capital Officers is to strategically plan for their workforce, looking at current capacities, skills, talent requirements, looking forward to where the mission is headed in the future, and making sure that intentional strategies are put in place to bridge that gap. Around 2010, Congress sort of expanded that mandate and started looking into how folks who aren't traditional federal employees, but are contractor or consulting firm employees, also augment the execution of agency missions. And so there was a move across the agencies to do what we would call multi-sector workforce planning. So to think about both that contractor, private sector, and public sector federal employee at the same time where you were thinking about mission execution and what talent it takes to get the mission done. I think that the last piece that's missing that is going to be imperative to address in the next several years is technology. So I don't think you can have an effective planning conversation with agency leadership that doesn't describe how individuals need technology to perform their jobs, including artificial intelligence, and how that affects the effectiveness and the responsibilities of a team. So I see a human and technology workforce planning being something that differentiates those organizations that modernize in the next several years.
This video podcast series is going out on a real high level with Travis Hoadley, Industry Executive Advisor over at SAP. Sir, thank you so much.
Thank you.